lawyers lay buried here near the banks of the North Saskatchewan River. They all died on the morning of November 27, 1885. They weren't killed in battle. They died at the hands of an executioner so that the Canadian government could send a message. The 1885 Northwest Rebellion was Canada's first and only civil war. Louis Riel and his Métis supporters were fighting for their culture and their way of life. For the most part, the Indians of the area wanted no part of the battle.
I don't think there's any doubt that the chiefs pretty well unanimously stayed out of the rebellion, did not support Riel and the uprising.
Blair Stonechild is a teacher and author of Western Canadian history. He says most First Nations remained loyal to the Crown, planning to honor the treaties they'd signed with Ottawa. The federal government, headed by Prime Minister John A. Macdonald, was planning something quite different.
Well, the government had had problems with the relations with Indians for quite some time prior to the rebellion. The government very much wanted Indians to remain quietly on the reserves and start to farm and basically not roam about.
The rebellion was the perfect excuse for the government to clamp down. The courts became a tool to intimidate the Indian people. Cree leaders like Poundmaker and Big Bear were imprisoned for crimes they had not committed. Other Indians received unusually severe sentences. Then an opportunity presented itself at Fort Battleford. 8 Indians were charged with murder. Some were genuinely guilty. They'd been settling personal vendettas. Others may have been innocent, but none of them was provided with a lawyer. With national attention focused on Riel's trial in Regina, all 8 were quietly condemned to death. All at the hands of one judge, Charles Rouleau, who was quoted saying, "It is high time Indians should be taught a severe lesson."
I mean, the situation was set for Rouleau basically to impose very harsh sentences, and the public demanded harsh sentences, and Rouleau was only too glad to deliver.
The Canadian government arranged to have all 8 men executed at once, and to bring in the Indians from the surrounding area to witness the spectacle. A message was being sent, and Prime Minister Macdonald said it best himself. The executions ought to convince the red man that the white man governs.
It was to be a spectacle, basically, that the Indian people were not to forget. And that was really the whole purpose of it, was to provide that spectacle and to send that message that the government was going to basically deal with Indians in a very firm way.
The executions were fast-tracked. While the condemned men were shackled and held in jail, they would have heard the sounds of the gallows being constructed right outside. Some accepted their fate. Others protested their innocence. But when Riel was hanged in Regina on November 16th, it became clear they would get no reprieve. Friday, November 27th, dawned cold and gray as the crowd gathered.
There's 150 Northwest Mounted Police who are lined up around the perimeter of the fort. The gallows were quite large, at least 20 feet long, and rose at least 10 feet over the ground. And so the Indians were brought up. They were allowed to say a statement. Some of them sang their death songs. And then there were black veils placed over their heads, and that was basically the signal for the pulling of the bolt.
6 died instantly. The other 2 choked and kicked briefly. In a few seconds, all 8 were gone. It was the largest mass execution in Canadian history.
Well, it really tells a story about the past. It tells a story about a time in history in which the attitudes towards Indian people were much different. Things which have made Aboriginal people feel that, there are these scars, as people have mentioned, from their past. The crowd that gathered here at Fort Battleford that morning watched the hangings in silent horror. They then quietly moved off as the bodies were placed in coffins. The executions that morning marked the low point in government-Indian relations,
And more than 100 years later, the memory of that event still haunts the local First Nations. I'm Bill Waiser.